So we've been having a lot of conversations about influence in this series. And for some of us, the idea of influence might not be all that new to us. You might have actually been told by somebody that you have a lot of influence through your role at school, serving at church, on a sports team, or maybe it's in a club. But for some of us, we might still be working through what this idea of having influence really means, because up until now, we haven't really thought about the impact that we could have on someone else's life. Either way, we're going to continue to look at this idea of the you effect, and we're going to learn how we can embrace the influence that we already have and the influence we have the potential to have, all while honoring God in the process. And today we're going to do that by looking at a story about someone who really wasn't in a position of leadership in his life, but he was willing to give all that he had. And in doing so, he was able to affect thousands of people. Now we know that Jesus had a lot of influence in his ministry. He's like the greatest influencer of all time. And it was absolutely nothing out of the ordinary for him to be followed by crowds of people through his years of ministry. Whether they had heard about who he was, they were seeking healing for something or someone in their life, or they were simply just curious, Jesus had a lot of influence and people were always around him. This story is no different. It's recorded in the Gospel of John, and we know that we can trust it because John was not only an eyewitness to the ministry of Jesus, but he was also someone that Jesus was very close to and deeply trusted. So join with me in John chapter 6. Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, and a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover festival was near. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Now imagine seeing Jesus perform these miracles and knowing that he's capable of doing impossible things. And then he comes to you as a disciple and asks for your advice on what to do. I don't know about you, but I'm kind of curious of why Jesus did that. But Philip responded, and he answered him saying it would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to only have a bite. In a sense, Philip is just kind of stating the obvious here, but the story continues. Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. "Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish, but how far will they go among so many?" Philip wasn't able to find a solution, and Andrew was able to find something small, but it was something, and that's when Jesus went to work. Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Now the thing is that women and children weren't recorded in things like this back then, but sociologists have determined, given on the time period, that the average ratio of women and children to men was around 5-1 or even 6-1. And what that means is that for every man, there were around 5 or 6 women and children in his family. From this, we can actually estimate that there could have been anywhere from upwards of 20 to 30,000 people present that day. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over, let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. After the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world." Now, there are so many different approaches and questions we can bring to this story, but today I want us to focus on the question of how each person impacted the story. First and foremost, there's Jesus. He was able to feed possibly 30,000 people off of one boy's lunch. He was being called prophet by the end of this story by people who had gathered from all over the place. Truth be told, that without Jesus, there really isn't a story to tell here at all. But the disciples also had a role. They had an impact through serving with Jesus and distributing the food to the crowd. Andrew specifically had an impact through looking for a solution, and he ended up finding the boy. This boy, with his small lunch of bread and fish, proved to be immensely influential. Not because of the amount that he brought to the table or to the field that day, but because of his willingness to be used. And the really cool thing to me about this story is that Jesus didn't need him to bring a certain amount of bread and fish to be able to perform this miracle. Jesus is the Son of God. He is God himself. He is more than able to accomplish his mission without our help. But that wasn't his plan. For it was recorded in verse 6 that Jesus knew what he had in mind to do before they even found the boy. And I bet you that Jesus knew that that boy was going to come that day. And he knew that he was going to be willing and obedient to give whatever he had. And let's say that Jesus didn't know how much that he was going to bring to the table that day, but he knew that it was going to be enough. And it was actually going to be more than enough. And this wasn't because that this boy was well known, or that he was studying to be a religious leader, or he was super popular or funny or athletic. It wasn't even because he was of a specific age. Ultimately, it was because of the power of Jesus and what Jesus was capable of doing through somebody who wanted to be used. Now, when it comes to your life and the world around you, it's about showing up. It's about being present for when it's time for you to offer what you have. Your strengths, your knowledge, your talents, your experiences, your time. Could be your food, or maybe one day it'll be the clothes off your back. But in order for you to be truly willing to give what you have to God, you have to recognize that you have more of an effect than you might think. And I'm not 100% sure, but I bet you might have had at least one time in your life where you felt like you didn't have anything of value to contribute. Trust me, I've been there. I've definitely felt like I had nothing that I could say or do to affect the situation, to change the outcome, or to even make a difference in somebody's life. The danger behind accepting these lies is that sometimes we will actually begin to tell ourselves that we know ourselves better than God does. And we may know our strengths, but we sure know our weaknesses, don't we? And if he knew my weaknesses, then God would know that I have no business in showing up. I have no business in getting involved, and I have nothing to bring to the table. What can happen is that instead of allowing God to work through our gifts and our offerings, we can actually allow our pride to twist our view of influence. But the truth about influence and having an impact is that it's not about doing more, having more, or knowing more. It's about using what we already have for God and for the people around us. It's about choosing to believe, even when it seems unbelievable, that you have an effect on your friend group. You have an effect on your section in band or choir or orchestra. You have effect on your teammates. You have an effect on your siblings and even your parents. You have an effect on your classmates, whether it's in person, on Zoom, Google Classroom, or whatever school has looked like for you recently. And we as GSM have an effect on the schools and communities around us. Now imagine what could happen when we choose to believe that we have more of an effect than we think. Imagine what God could do through the you effect in your life and the people around you. Imagine all of the ways that you could be used for good. And even if this feels kind of uncomfortable right now and a little intimidating, I just challenge you to consider the possibility that the magnitude of what Jesus did through one boy's small lunch is something that he can echo through your life and your influence. Let's begin this process by doing 3 things. The first is identifying the who. Who are the people in your life right now, right in front of you, that you have the potential to influence? Maybe it's your siblings or your parents or whoever you're living with these days. Even though your friends aren't physically in front of you, maybe it's one of them. Next, we have to identify what it is that they truly need. Maybe it's a word of encouragement. It's a commitment to praying over a prayer request that they have right now. Maybe it's accountability in a sin struggle that you know they have. Maybe it's simply just help doing chores or homework or something like that. After you've been able to identify the need, we'll bring it together by figuring out what it is that you can do to help. Asking yourself how you can personally meet their need. And now, for the most important and sometimes scariest part of this, we have to actually go do it. And even if this idea still seems so intimidating to you right now, I want us to pause and think about somebody who has had a positive effect on our lives. Think about somebody who has slowed down enough to see the need that you had. And whatever it was that they did for you, that they were able to create a lasting effect on your life, the same way that they were able to affect you, you have the very same ability to make a difference on others. All you have to do is just do these 3 steps. Identify the who, identify the need, and identify what you can do to help. And as we commit to doing these 3 things, we have to remember something really important, okay? God is the only person and will always be the only one who can change people. He's going to do all the work behind the scenes. All that we have to do is show up. Bring what you have. Bring all that you've got. Offer it up to God for His glory, not our own. And with faith, let Him do the work. He is faithful, and I promise you, when you commit to offering what you have to be used for good, you'll be surprised by what He's able to do through your you effect.